right, excellent. Well, I'm glad everyone is able to come tonight. Thank you for coming. Welcome to Prairie Lights. I'm Kathleen Johnson of Prairie Lights, and tonight I'm very pleased to welcome Casey Walker back to Prairie Lights to read from his novel, Last Days in Shanghai. Casey's a fairly recent graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, and while he was a student here, he spent a great deal of time in our cafe, right over there, writing. So I'm still kind of used to him being in there while we're doing this in here, but this is really nice. It'll be nice to have him on this side of the podium, and his hard work really paid off. Last Days in Shanghai has gotten some great reviews. It received starred reviews in both Kirkus and Publishers Weekly and has been reviewed by the New York Times and the Times Literary Supplement. Jim Shepard, author of Like You'd Understand Anyway, says, Last Days in Shanghai is about how easily we live our lives in thrall to our own evasions and how fervently we hope for redemption. And Charles Baxter, author of The Feast of Love, states, Casey Walker's truly brilliant first novel about Americans in China pioneers a kind of hallucinatory realism on the subject that leaves the reader laughing and appalled and scared. Last Days in Shanghai knows just how bad things can get, and its hero, an innocent abroad before he gets wised up, is as American as apple pie and the Republican Party. Casey Walker has an MFA from the University of Iowa Writers Workshop and a PhD in English literature from Princeton. He has been published in The Believer, Esquire, Narrative, Boston Review, and the LA Review of Books. He lives in New York, and we're very happy to have him back here at Prairie Lights. Please welcome Casey Walker.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Kathleen. And thanks to Prairie Lights for hosting me tonight. It's true that I spent an inordinate amount of time on the other side of the doors in that cafe. I did the last edits of this book were completed for the most part in this cafe right behind you. My author photo was taken in an alley right across the street from here. I've spent a great deal of time in this bookstore, and one of the sort of habits that I fell into over the years, and especially as I was kind of nearing the end of working on this book, and it was getting more and more difficult in the last kind of edits, is I would, if I started to feel like really sort of demoralized and depressed with the writing and how the writing was going, invariably, like the technique I developed to cheer myself up was I would just go downstairs and buy a book on my way out of Prairie Lights, and it was always like there was something heartening about like grabbing someone else's completed novel and starting to read it that felt like this was actually a possible thing. It got to be a very expensive habit. It was just like slowly amounting to like hundreds of dollars a month. But basic, I mean, this I felt like this bookstore with the workshop really just anchored my time here, and it was kind of impossible to conceive of living in Iowa without it. So thank you for hosting me all those other days, and for hosting me tonight. So there's a lot of reasons this is a particularly, I think, special reading for me. This is actually this is the tail end. It's the very last reading, as far as I know, for my hardcover kind of book extravaganza that's been going on since December. And, for a while, I mean, what starts to happen is you sort of read over and over and over from your book, as you start to develop these ideas about it that are not actually the ideas that you had while you were writing it. Like, you get so used to talking about writing it, and you get so used to like the kind of public language that you've developed about your book that you start to forget that those aren't actually the ideas you necessarily had as you were writing the books. Like, it's really the way in which, like you want to take credit for writing the book that Jim Shepard said you wrote, and so then you just start acting like you actually did write the book that Jim Shepard said you wrote, and you become this kind of jacket copy version of yourself. And so I feel in talking about this book, like I've developed this whole kind of public language for how I talk about this book and how I present it to people and how I more or less shill for it. But I feel like tonight, at the very end here, with a lovely audience of very familiar faces and writer friends, I was thinking what I want to do is actually try to get back to some of the ideas that actually initially animated the book that I was writing. So less the book that I've been telling people I wrote, and more the book that I actually thought I was writing as I wrote it. So one of the things, I mean, basically the way this book started was just a trip to China in which I traveled around for a couple of weeks. I subsequently went back a few years later when I had already kind of drafted this book. And it was just this sort of spectacular shock of being in these cities and being in these places where the kind of urban upheaval and the pace of the building and construction and the size and the scope and the sort of changing lives that were going on there was truly astonishing. I mean, it was actually, when I first went to China, I had been living in New York for a number of years, so I sort of thought I knew what a big city felt like, and I sort of thought I knew what a large kind of urban metropolitan space felt like. And then you get to a place like Shanghai, and you realize that New York City is a quiet backwater compared to what's going on in China. And there was just a sense for me that I wanted to capture the kind of changeover that was happening in those cities. And it struck me that I could basically just have somebody there, a consciousness there, that also didn't quite apprehend what he was looking at in these spaces, and that there could just be some kind of correlation between this changeover in consciousness that's taking place in the narrator as he sort of slowly understands what he's been involved in, and the changeover that's happening in those cities. I mean, that was basically the idea. So there was an immense amount of sort of kind of landscape and urban description that went into this, that to me was just sort of tracking things that were going on in the character's life himself. And I also knew that the cities were changing so fast that by the time I finished the book, it was no longer going to be current. Like, there was no way to keep pace with a place like Shanghai, and there was no way to keep pace with a place like Beijing at this current, historical moment of late capitalism. So what I wanted to do was to sort of constrict the focus to a particular kind of just a week in the life of one of these places, knowing that the book in a way was like sort of going out of date, so that by the time if it ever saw the light of day, which I spent a long time thinking it wouldn't, if it ever saw the light of day, it would almost be like an elegy for a time that no longer quite exists. So I think if you tried to use this, I think even now as a guidebook to Shanghai, that would be like 28 more skyscrapers where the three I described are. So what I'm going to do now is actually just read to you from, this book takes place just over the course of a week, and it takes place in 5 different cities. Beijing, Shanghai, a city in central China called Kaifeng. There's one sort of break in the forward motion where they go back to Venice for a moment, just in kind of past time. And then there's a couple brief scenes in New York City. And because those cities and these places were what kind of inspired me so much, I'm just going to read to you a kind of set of montage snippets of all those places. So this is either going to be an interesting peek into the things that animated me as I wrote, or like a really bad prose poetry montage of a lot of different landscapes. So report back to me at the end about how this all goes. But this also spares you and spares me any sense of having to give you like a sort of a full like setup context for reading to you from the middle of a novel, where you have to be like, okay, and so then what you need to know for this section is these guys double-crossed these guys, and then these other guys showed up, like watching like season 3 of The Wire without having watched the first 2 seasons of it. So basically you can just let the landscapes wash over you and not really worry about the character names. That's my sort of goal here for reading from this novel. So we're going to start in Beijing at the Forbidden City, which is right at the center of it. The Forbidden City was a corpse of its former power, its anatomy forcibly preserved from ruin, like Mao's. The open squares were hot and shadeless, white and blinding. The fresh red buildings and yellow roof tiles looked brighter still against the background of gray sky. Squint your eyes and it was all on fire. The tiny bands of blue around the entryway doors like the hottest part of the flame, and the concrete walkways the colors of ash. It was easy now to walk through the center of an empire, open to anyone now that there was no longer an emperor. What was truly forbidden, the secrets of power these courtyards once held, was still forbidden, of course. It had just been relocated to office buildings and conference rooms. We crossed marble bridges and walked quickly through gardens built for the recitation of poetry, and Leo told me as we hurried that this morning's meeting was just as he suspected. Beijing promised an erratic officialdom, tense and sensitive to slight. He read their wariness as a general trait of the Chinese. I was willing to trust the research I'd assembled and say that official Beijing's suspicion of foreigners was not paranoid invention. 200 years of British trading companies and gunboat diplomacy, of French concessions and Portuguese merchant cities, Japanese adventuring and Western opium, Chinese coastal cities built for the profit of financial capitals that were oceans away, and the internal distress. In just 100 years, an empire had fallen, nationalist reign gave way to a communist insurgency and a civil war. A victorious Mao proclaimed a republic from the back gate of the forbidden city in which we stood. United States policy for most of Mao's rule was that he didn't exist, that the real China was a tiny island 100 miles off the coast occupied by a defeated army turned political kleptocracy. A quarter century of Mao's rule marked time by peasant starvation and burned temples, with anyone vaguely bookish or otherwise politically suspect sent to rural labor camps to be re-educated by the working peasantry. And Leo complained the officials seemed tense. The congressman rushed through the Forbidden City as quickly as he had skimmed my briefing book. He showed no interest in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, massed above us on its terrace with a double-hipped roof that looked like it floated on air. Leo claimed he knew plenty about China already, but I found he was often sloppy with that kind of knowledge, too prone to trust his dimly rendered general picture. He was pleased, though, to have diagnosed our frosty reception. He thought it was part of some Chinese national personality disorder. He liked ice to crack. There's no charm without resistance. I lagged behind him. I peeked into closed-off sections of the complex. The side courts were in disrepair and the interior buildings almost entirely off limits to our prying. Here is where the Dowager Empress Cixi made her extravagant demands. Here is where Puyi took the throne and lost it. And now we're going to move. I'm sort of picturing this like in those Indiana Jones movies when like they're on the plane and there's that sort of red line that's flying them between cities. So now we're going to fly from Beijing to a city in central China called Kaifeng, where the assistant has been sent on an errand for his boss. Our police escort sped us down avenues of red lights and no cars. We reached an empty toll road. Along the forlorn new highway was farmland and eventually people. The farmers of Henan province had the Yellow River to keep them in crops and disaster, not so different from the eastern part of California where my family still lived, where fortunes had been similarly lost and found in the cycles of a silty river prone to flood. Except these people had lost more and lost longer. I saw none of the big ag machines I knew from growing up rural. This toil was by hand and plow, in the shadow of bulbous-bottomed power plants fed by coal. I watched the smokestack spout and imagined it was blue sky they were discharging into the already blackened air. Kaifeng, Xu said, has a history of 2,700 years. It is the birthplace of Chinese civilization. We feel that among the projects of Bund International, the nearest example for Mr. Fillmore's airport project is the Kaifeng achievement. I hadn't heard of Kaifeng before last night. Population 5 million. I wasn't sure I'd heard the details of a Leo Fillmore airport project either. We neared the outskirts of the city, where deep concrete bathtubs portended future skyscrapers. Loaded cranes swung packets of steel beam 30 stories up in the air. Metric tons of movement that looked offhand and casual. Shoes indicated this would be a high-tech district for drugs and microprocessors, the best in the world. Other Chinese cities had boomed overnight, supplying the consuming earth with socks and cigarette lighters or buttons and toothpaste. But Shoes wanted me to know he was no dealer in cheap textiles and coat clasps. This complex was meant for higher order exploration, circuits past the limits of human computation, next-generation pharmaceuticals designed to bring contentment and well-being. Now that he'd turned pitchman, shoes sounded dutiful, and beneath that, even melancholy. I looked out the window at the workers' housing, cramped outbuildings sitting on the perimeter of the construction site. His abrupt silence as we passed those trailers left the impression that Shoes saw things far beyond what he was willing to describe to me. I felt he was gazing at the coruscating machinery, the denuded landscape, the laborers' small temporary homes, and feeling at least passingly sorry for his role in it. So now we zoom out of Kaifeng on our Indiana Jones plane to later that night, sort of in the center of town, in the center of Kaifeng. We drove after dinner, a night tour for my benefit. The Yellow River had long ago claimed what was left of the city of the Northern Song, the last dynasty to have made Kaifeng its capital. Somewhere under the silt were its palaces. Now the city was the rising steam of pork buns, the smoke of open-air fires, the whine and whistle of pasted-together motorcycles. Mao had Beijing's walls torn down. Veneration of old things was an impediment to revolutionary progress. But here the city walls remained, saved by Kaifeng's irrelevance. The sky was high, the emperor far away. Out of Kaifeng, we're going to return for a moment to Beijing. You can sort of picture, as I'm moving through these landscapes, what's happening in this kind of narrative story time is mostly the assistant is getting more and more mired in his boss's errands and being sort of ping-ponged from place to place and not really sure what he's being asked to do. And at least in my conception of this book, a lot of that is getting pushed out into these descriptions of the city itself. So he's returned to Beijing after Kaifeng. Outside, the bright mix of smog and sun, call it smog shine, made my eyes swell and itch. My taxi driver loitered in standstill traffic. Long ago, Beijing had been laid out on an orthogonal grid, a Ming-era design of concentric squares and ring roads that concealed the forbidden city at its center. But that Ming pattern was now so swallowed by opportunistic sprawl, the pattern makers would have been lost instantly in the city they'd made. Last 5 years only, the driver said, enunciating every syllable, pausing at the end of every word. He nodded happily to himself when he finished the sentence. What's that? I felt guilty asking him to clarify. Everything, he said. He took both hands from the steering wheel and swept them across the length of the windshield, horizon to city horizon. Ordinarily, this would have been a frightening maneuver to watch, but since we were basically parked, the car didn't demand much of his attention. Next year, people see, he said. Olympics. The last word was a hurdle for him, but he spoke proudly. I wanted to join him in his enthusiasm, but my thoughts were full to bursting. We nudged like worms into Beijing's dirt. Off the freeway, the city chaos felt like the objective form of my personal circumstances, entirely continuous with a glimpsed police captain on my plane and the gifted briefcase at my arm. A boy on the side of the road tried to fix the bent wheel frame of his bike, and his friend pumped air into the back tire, and above them, a team of workers adjusted the wirings of a leaning power post, while off in the farther distance, a line of men as small as a row of pigeons stood at the roofline of an unfinished apartment tower. In all that flatness of Beijing before me, girls cut hair, and blind men busked folk songs on erus, and attendants cleaned public restrooms. Life teemed out to the distant northern mountains, invisible today in the sandy wind. An old woman replaced yesterday's paper with today's at a display stand where people read as they waited for the bus. Beijing had the traffic of a city being evacuated. Cars and motorcycle rickshaws were piled into the road like all these buildings were in flames, and every one of us fled a column of consuming fire. So now he's leaving Beijing. And happy about it. Well, happy is not the word. This is him leaving Beijing. I dragged myself up the jetway and boarded to flight attendant scowls just before they barred the door. As we ascended, I watched Beijing recede. Leaving the city offered me one small relief. The image of the police captain grew minute to me like the shrinking towers. I had never thought much or long about what might come after this life. But that morning I was so out of sorts, so dubious about whether I would find Leo in Shanghai and what state he would be in if I did, that I had the strangest vision. I suddenly felt in sympathetic contact with a world of bygone things, a world of ghosts. With the lone exception of the Forbidden City, what I saw in Beijing below was the manic destruction of every bit of the architectural past. It was like getting rid of the past tense of a language. The present tense was supermalls with 8 lucky floors and big box convention centers and starry hotels for people like me. Residents evicted in favor of those just passing through. It made me think that if the spirit world was anything like our own, their desires must tend toward what they lack. They would spend all their time thinking of the beloved objects they could never touch again. So how the ghosts must wail as we bulldozed ourselves the present, tore their walls out of joint, and pulled down their pylons, and leveled the gardens where they had once found peace. Shanghai. I slipped out of the car and into the crowd at the promenade along the Hungpu River, filled with Chinese tourists and a few Germans from the sound of it. All the Chinese tour groups wore bright, flimsy baseball caps that couldn't hold a shape. A young couple in red hats staggered in front of me with wonder in their faces. They might have been even more confused by the city than I was. Bussed in from some distant interior province where all the hills still had names. The boy handed me his heavy camera, and I tried to frame him alongside his girlfriend's shining face with the looming hypodermic needle of the Oriental Pearl Tower behind them. They looked so happy in the viewfinder. The camera needed a hard push and made a loud click. We exchanged vigorous bowing nods as they backed away. The dark walkway reinforced the presence of buildings on either side of the river. And along arched road to my right ran the colonial architecture built by the British and the French, back when Shanghai was either the Paris of the East or the horror of the Orient. Across the river, Pudong's instant skyscrapers towered out of wet, sinking sand, a whole new city plugged into a substrate primed for liquefaction the minute the earth rumbled. You could mistake the Hongpu for the river of time itself, I guess, the ever-flowing present that divides past and future. As the muddy water deformed the lights of the Bund and Pudong towers, I found it almost too easy to come detached from the life I had been living. It wasn't so solid or so constant. I felt several years of effort go limp in my hands. That's what it feels like to write a novel. Leah's disappearance lifted a veil. I heard an oceanic rushing through my ears. I felt the shape of my head for its skeletal parts, poked at the jawbone that would outlast me. The rushing would not stop. I thought of the morning my father died, and how brown the park grass had looked, and how I had never stopped seeing the dead patches among the green. I thought of taking Alex to dinner in Venice one night, and how she worried she'd spoiled it just by asking me to talk about my job, and what I stayed in it for, and what I expected. I'd acted like she was the naive one, the way she talked about compromise, while holding a champagne glass and a steak knife. So now we backtrack for a moment. It's the one sort of movement into sort of backwards time in the novel, to a trip that he took with his girlfriend, Alex, to Venice a year before the present action. So this is Venice, which I think is the most beautiful place on earth. At the docks outside Marco Polo Airport, Alex and I were impatient and excitable, and it felt impossible to wait half an hour for the next groaning vaporetto, so we jumped instead into a handsome water taxi of polished golden wood. We couldn't help notice more gold in our ferryman's hair. He powered through the shallow channel, quickly passing one of the lumbering water buses. Tucked into the back of our speeding craft, we watched our pilot standing up to the wind, the front end of our boat erect and out of the water. We were the fast and clever creatures who had won the waters from the monsters of the old lagoon. Our boat bounced off a wake. This is what it must be like, I thought, to be two less limited people. The driver had a tan without splotch or burn and a ruffled white shirt undone 3 buttons from the top. I teased Alex for how she watched him. The boat spun hard left. We knocked into each other. I have to say again how she looked, laughing so hard with her hair in her mouth. Not just beautiful, but unself-conscious, at ease with herself and with me. Everything was in precise counterpoint to the hours of plane flights. Flight, think of it, at 30,000 feet, at 500 miles an hour. It should be a miracle, and yet we had drained it of all magic. It was our expensive little boat that felt like the miracle. We came around the cemetery island. Alex whistled us past, and I hushed because I couldn't whistle at all. Her hand flew past my face to point at 2 of St. Mark's gray bulbs appearing through the haze like they had just been sketched there a moment ago. The triangle top of the campanile stood beside them, pointing up at her own pointing finger. I thought right then that everything would work out. Alex and me. I thought that my own life, even with the still recent sadness of my father's death, might still end up a lucky thing. We looped under the fishtail of the far bits of the island, a city that had been dropped from the sky, shattered into 100 pieces and bridged carefully back together again. Lido was south, the barrier island protecting us from the open water of the Adriatic, and we sped through the middle channel between San Giorgio Maggiore and the Doge Palace, shining and slightly pink. Palladio's church suffered in a full-body cast, its scaffolding reminding us that even paradise required maintenance. We motored past the launch in front of Harry's Bar, west of where the Vaporetto shoved travelers out at San Marco, and turned up the mouth of the Grand Canal. We took a smaller inlet, and the driver weaved into a dock fronting a hotel. He took Alex by her forearms and steadied her up. I didn't want to get out of the boat. I paid him out of my wallet, though I felt I had crossed over from ordinary life and should be paying by otherworldly custom with the coins left in my mouth at death. A couple 30 years older than us waited to board our boat. They managed to come across as both elegant and drunk, the lady with a gold brooch swaying from top-shelf gin. The ferryman sped off, leaving Alex and me looking down into the wake with our hearts broken. Broken because we could never have back those moments of first arrival, no matter how perfect that it had happened and that we were here. One more city. This is New York. This is just a very quick paragraph about what it feels like to live in New York as a young, struggling 20-something, which I am no longer. Still struggling, just no longer in the 20s. I'd never been able to connect the hazy first time I came to meet Alex in New York with any other visit. There was a subway we took over a bridge without a name, across a river I thought was the Hudson, and later learned was not. We'd walk to a mysterious bar on some shrieking avenue in Brooklyn, where I sat with her trying to piece together what was going to become of us. I remembered the church across the street and its huge marquee, Jesu Cristo es el Señor. Though I knew now that the train was the Q, the bridge the Manhattan, the river the east beneath us, which is really an estuary, and the street distant 4th Avenue, I had still never been able to assimilate any of that later knowledge into my first picture of New York City, when it was so new and unknown to me. Now she lived with 2 other girls on the garden level of a poorly maintained townhouse just off the Brooklyn side of the bridge, in a makeshift bedroom where a folding screen was her only privacy. They were all giving up whatever they had to live here. No one sure yet who would bear it out and prosper, and who would be just more fuel, burned up to realize other people's dreams. Thanks. Good.
Casey Walker will be happy to take questions. So raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you so your question will be picked up on the live stream and so that everyone can hear it. just to start us out, I wonder if you could tell us how the idea for the book was born and how you chose the setting and how that all came about.
Yeah, totally accidentally. I mean, I had the opportunity to go to China for a couple of weeks in 2007. I traveled around for a couple of weeks. And the day I got back, I think I abandoned the novel that I had been working on for the previous 3 years and thought, I'm going to start writing about China and I'm going to figure out what comes of this. And it was basically a matter of finding a story that would help me braid through all of the stuff about China and what was going on there, especially development-wise. These are the sort of parts I read about, right? Like the kind of upheaval. And it so happened that I had a friend who worked as an assistant to a congressman for a very long time. So I thought the kind of congressional junket angle would be a nice way to get somebody. Like, what I didn't want was just like a backpacking white guy walking around China thinking some serious thoughts. I wanted there to be some sort of like propulsive momentum for why he was there and what was happening. So the kind of political angle, from this friend, I happen to know like a fair amount about what it was like to travel with a belittling congressman. And that sort of made its way into the book as a kind of architectural kind of structure that just weaves together a lot of the stuff that I wanted to write about.
Well, were you in school at the time that you took the trip, or what?
Well, I mean, nominally, I was a graduate student. I mean, to the extent that that's, the demands on your time are somewhat minimal. I was doing it. It was when I was in the middle of my PhD, and I think it was a semester where I wasn't teaching. So I was basically just able, like, you can drop everything in April and go to China for 3 weeks if you're, a PhD student. So that's what I did.
But a lot of what's in this book is a lot of corruption, not really the kind of thing that you would see as a tourist.
Right.
Not necessarily. I've not been there.
Right.
So how did you create that aspect?
I looked into my corrupt inner soul, and I realized that I am all about graft, fraud, complicity, and complacency of various sorts. Now, obviously, there was a ton of research that went into doing this. And the thing is, I would email my friend who had worked in Congress for a long time, and I would be like, so how much of this is starting to strain like credulity here? Like, can a congressman really accept an all expenses paid trip funded by a private business to go to a foreign country and just kind of travel around getting drunk and carousing with prostitutes? And he was like, are you kidding? This happens all the time. Like, basically everything that I said, I was like, is this pushing the boundaries? He would write me back this story. He's like, so let me tell you what these guys just did in Israel. You know what I mean? Like, oh, like actually at a certain point, my fear in the first drafts of the book was that it was this kind of hyper reality in which I was verging into sort of airport thriller territory. And then every email I would get back from my friend, he would be like, at the end I was like, oh, I'm just soft pedaling this basically. Like, it is so much worse than you could possibly imagine. So yeah, take that home to sleep on.
Raise your hand. One interesting aspect of the book is the role of the interpreter. You've got Lily, who is often the only woman in the room, right? Right. How do you decide how much power to give an interpreter? I always wonder that, because this is someone who's sort of privy to both sides in a way that I just...
Yeah, she became for me like a very an interesting character as somebody who's just quite literally like pitched between the two sides, where her sort of her role as a go-between gives her privileged access to information that that the two parties don't have necessarily about one another. Like, she's the one who knows when the Chinese officials are insulting the Americans, when the Americans don't know they're being insulted, and she's also the one who knows who understands when the Americans are doing that right back. She started as a fairly sort of functional figure in the book, right? Like, you sort of need an interpreter there. And then I started to see a sort of parallelism over the course of the novel and the course of the drafting, developing between her situation and the narrator's situation, which they're both, they're both sort of beholden to fairly horrible entities and trying to kind of slowly navigate their way in their particular positions through it. And so the bond that starts to develop between them as these two people who are sort of complicit in what's going on, but who are also sort of horrified by what they've slowly gotten themselves into. I spent a long time thinking about just the role of being an assistant. I mean, there was a time when I was, again, in my 20s in New York, like everybody I knew across industries was like working for somebody terrible, right? Like in film and publishing and finance and whatever. Like it was just this boss to assistant relationship, and the way those boundaries become so permeable where it's no longer a professional relationship. It's like this weird, toxic, almost parental relationship, and the way all the boundaries just sort of bleed out. And I have a long passage in here about all the kind of indignities that he has to do. He sort of like is there while his boss is getting a colonoscopy kind of thing. And it's just like, that's true. That's like a stolen from life detail, I really do know somebody who had to like do the diabetes blood check on his boss every morning and just like lift the shirt up, get the hairy back. And I mean, it was, it's like the worst stuff, but it's like what you do for $28,000 a year in New York.
What was hello? Thanks for reading.
Hi, thank you.
Looking forward to reading the book.
Appreciate that.
What was the most difficult thing about writing this book, and how did you surmount it?
Oh my God. This book, it's funny. Like this book took me so long. This book took me so long to write. I mean, this ended up from when I first started it back in 2007 to when I sort of finally turned in the last edits, September 2014. I mean, that's like 6 or 7 years. I mean, there was a time where I put it aside for a good year because I couldn't look at it anymore, and I had just hit not just a wall, like a series of walls somehow. And what's funny about it is like you tell people you spent 6 years on a book, and it's like, oh, you must be some sort of artist who labored over it. And it's like, you don't feel like Flaubert. You just feel like a failure. Like you just feel like you've failed to know how to do this thing. And there's shelves full of books here, like other people know how to do it, right? Like you just can't figure out why you can't put it together. I think the thing that I had to overcome was from moving from writing short stories to writing a novel, is you get all this freedom in a novel all of a sudden, just the freedom of page count. And you think a novel can contain anything. I can put anything into this. I can just fill up this. I got this giant grocery sack, and I'm just going to put everything I can into it. And when you figure out that you're actually under the same rules of expediency and constriction that you are in much shorter forms, that was the real breakthrough for me. Like I actually put this aside for about 9 months. I wrote a bunch of short stories. And when I came back from writing short stories, where the end is inscribed in the beginning, and sort of every you can't have long kind of looping circular conversations and dinners and stuff that are the kind of things that I write in here. I was like, oh, this shit's gotta go. Like so the original, I think one of the original drafts of this at its like worst and baggiest was like 125,000 words. And the version that's published here is 65. I mean, it got almost half as long. And it's better for it. I mean, it's really like the deleted scenes are like nothing that anyone needs to go like dig up or anything. You know what I mean? There's not like, if you liked this, you'll like even more of it. Like it's all the stuff that was just, what's funny is I actually didn't really lose that many like sort of cities or scenes. Like everything just got super slimmed down. So that was what I eventually figured out. Oh, thank God.
Hello. Yeah. I wanted to ask, what sort of research did you do for inhabiting
I'm just anticipating.
Already, I've achieved my aim.
Yeah. Yeah.
What sort of research did you do for inhabiting the different cities that you wrote about, and how did you characterize the urban environment?
Great. I actually thought that was going in a totally different direction. There's a number of scenes, because this is like these are politicians, and this is official China, where let's say the rules for prostitution are a little more lax than they might be, at least more visible than they are in this country. I don't know if the rules are more lax. It's certainly more accepted part of doing official business in China. So there are a number of scenes, for the sake of realism, that take place in massage parlors and karaoke places and with other assorted ladies of the night. And really what I thought you were going to ask me, because I have been asked this at many a reading, is where'd you get all that knowledge of like what a Chinese massage parlor look like? Just like books. All from books. In terms of the urban environment stuff, I mean, I think I had been writing a dissertation for a long time when I started this novel that was on basically urban development in the United States and Europe, and how that was reflected in the novel, but in like the early 20th century. And then I got to China, and I saw all of these things that I had been reading about for the kind of shock effects of huge building projects. I mean, this is when you're building metros. This is when you're building like long distance sort of train networks, omnibuses, all the other stuff that we now think of as sort of characterizing the modern city. And it just sort of, for me, I had this realization that the things I had been reading about what it might have been like to live in London in 1910, right, or New York at the turn of the century, the way that's characterized by urban historians maps almost exactly, in certain ways, onto the things that are going on in contemporary China. I mean, right down to the degradation of environmental stuff. I mean, residents evicted, huge kind of building projects that are ostensibly for the public good, where all the money disappears and nothing ever gets built. I mean, a lot of the sort of spectacular corruption of that mapped on pretty directly the stuff that I'd already been reading about. And then from there, there's shelves and shelves full at my house and in the bookstores of studies of kind of contemporary China, and I tried to get my hands on everything possible while writing it. And actually what's funny is all of that research that I had to do, because I was so petrified about writing about a place that I didn't feel I knew that well, that's some of the stuff that ballooned the novel, right? And that was just like my own insecurity, like being like, no, I'm going to establish that I know what I'm talking about by giving you a deep urban history, right? And then you're like, actually, I don't need that, right? Like that can go out once you sort of know it.
Well, since you presumably workshopped some of this book at Iowa.
Actually, yeah, continue.
Or did you?
I actually, this particular one was actually so substantially, I mean, it wasn't completed. It was the big ugly version of it that I still had. But by the time I got to Iowa, I was so depressed and ashamed about this particular project that I didn't want to show it to people. So I mostly workshopped short stories and a new novel thing that I've been working on now. But I read from this to various people. And I didn't formally workshop it, but many people who are close friends of mine who are thanked in the book did read drafts of it and kind of helped me with it. So it was informally workshopped, I would say. And there's certainly things that I learned in the workshop where I was just like, oh yeah, that's great. I'll scribble that down, like go home and start, or actually go to Prairie Lights and start editing again.
Sure. Well, my question's kind of not exactly relevant. I was going to ask what differed in the feedback you got from the publishing world specifically.
Yeah. I mean, I did have, because I did have readers here who read it. And actually, I think the publishing world is a funny place. I mean, my agent was much more, I have a very kind of hands-on, editorially minded agent, and he was much more like my sort of workshop readers and just figuring out. He wanted to know, he wanted to slim down some scenes. He had questions about characterization. I mean, he had a lot of the kind of classic workshop stuff. in terms of the editor, I mean, the publishing house, they did a lot of work. I did a lot of work with them on it too, mostly continuing to cut and slim down. But those conversations actually get like really pretty different from, I mean, it's funny because workshop can be a frustrating conversation in certain ways, but you don't know frustration until you've like talked to like a publishing house in certain ways. Like that, I mean, I ended up at a place that I think was really great and pitched the book in the right way. But a lot of what publishers are doing is like they are the experts at it. They want to talk about package and jacket copy and cover design and how to market it and like how to attach certain words to it to get it in the right. And it's not ultimately all that helpful for you as a writer to hear. It certainly doesn't help you write more books. It's like actually the kind of thing you need to forget to like come back and start working again. Workshop is much kinder.
Yay. Like, where's my money? So I really loved the line you read just about sort of this bizarre amnesia, city skyline amnesia,
right.
where the past tense has been abolished,
right.
and there's this like architectural
right.
sort of denial of any kind of history. And I was thinking about how skillful when I was reading the book. Every time you would reference this past relationship or this dissolution of sort of on two fronts, right? Romantic and then also just the human time capsule that is your father.
Right.
Was that always a part of the book, Casey? Or was that something subterranean that kind of came to the fore? Or how did you decide when you were going to reference Luke's personal past?
Yeah, in terms of the personal past, I mean, what's interesting, so Luke's personal past, right? I mean, so one of the things that comes up often in this book, although it's it's just told over the course of a week in China, but one of the things that kind of circulates through his consciousness at various times is about 18 months before the present time of the book, his father kind of dies unexpectedly, and then his girlfriend, who also works in Congress, and this is just something that happens. Like her boss dies, and then it's like, well, you're out of a job. Right, like the congressman you worked for is dead, so see ya. Like, I mean, you just get a little bit of severance and you go on your way. So in the course of this kind of like 18-month period, his girlfriend moves away, and they sort of try to make it work, and it falls apart. And his dad dies, and that was always there from the very beginning about the kind of pressure that was going to be there on his consciousness as he moves forward. But I had set myself this bizarre series of rules. When I sat down to start writing this, I had thrown away another project that had, I felt like, all of this like long, intense kind of expository rumination and kind of circling back into the past and everything else. I'd been reading a lot of Proust at the time. And one of the rules I set for myself for this was like forward motion only. Like there are no flashbacks. We're just going to go forward. And I was trying to set myself these rules and deny myself certain modernist sort of techniques so that I could see if I could tell a story from sort of beginning to end. So one of the ways I had to do that was to sort of, in order to keep the story sort of moving forward, and how do I tell a story about this past relationship and his father without actually, I cheated a couple times, but without actually tracking back to give you those scenes from the past. Like I have to find another language to talk about it. And it just seemed in this, it just seemed sort of perfect to have this past that's falling down around him and these gargantuan things going up in its place. And for that to be like, well, that's the language that I'm going to use to describe. I mean, actually I think I did become, I think that's one of the ideas that I maybe did become conscious of late in the book, but it's one of those ones where you're just like, I would like to take credit for having thought that the whole time, right? Round two.
The books at the table are free, right?
Yeah, it's just to give away. It's just to give away free for all.
No,
just to give away free for all.
No, buy the books. Don't do what I did. What's this next project that you've been talking about?
Well, the next project is something that I actually did workshop, and that has been. I see faces in the room who've read portions of it. I finally sort of I grew up in this very small town on the border with Mexico in California, where my town is like a population 25,000, and just across the border is this Mexican city. It's like population 1 million. So it was just sort of felt like growing up simultaneously in like rural agricultural small town America with like Babylon across the border. That to a 15-year-old it's just like, you have a bullfighting ring. And any number of things that I'm not going to mention on a live stream. And I think as we do, right, like we have these familiar stories. I mean, these stories that are familiar to us about growing up or about our parents or about, that I think it can take a long time as a writer to circle back to that material, to sort of find your way back into it in a way where you're either not so familiar with it that you bore yourself to death, or just you're not ready to touch it yet. And the other thing, or I was always afraid too, that like, not only that I wouldn't do the stories I wanted to tell justice, but that I would that would like really screw it up. So I've tried a number of times to write about where I'm from and always thrown it away. So now finally, the trick I discovered was to estrange it from myself just enough by setting it not in the town that I grew up in the 80s, but the town that I grew up in as it would have existed in like the 1920s. So it's a historical-ish thing, which is another terrifying research project. But yeah, it's just finally circling back to sort of border country, and I'm slowly pecking away at it. But I'm excited about it, and I think I've handed it out to people in this room. So sorry, guys.
Hi, Stacey.
Hey.
So now that you're working on your second novel, like Edward P. Jones was here a few weeks ago, and he was talking about how, like, oh, don't start a novel until you know everything to the very last scene. And then and I thought, okay, that's awfully
In other words, he
cool.
said, "Quit now."
And Ian Lee recently was talking about, kind of imagining the whole container of the novel before you begin.
Yeah.
And so now that you're starting another one, especially because it involves research, do you feel like you can intuit the whole shape of it as you're beginning, or do you kind of feel it out?
That's a fantastic question. The other thing I think there's another, just to add to your beautiful list, Charlotte. I remember reading a thing where Gabriel Garcia Marquez said that he couldn't start a story or a novel until he would get like a stack of pages. He wanted to know exactly how many. He had to know sort of exactly how many pages it would sort of stack up to, right? Like what the weight of it would be, like how that would sort of feel, right? So yeah, that idea of having a sense of what the scope of the project is before you begin. I would say that unlike Edward P. Jones and unlike Ian Lee and unlike Gabriel Garcia Marquez, I know very little when I begin. I sometimes know very little by the end, and I rely on people. I rely on the good graces of people afterwards to try to. I mean, this is what readers are really good for, right? Like giving it to friends and having people report back to you what they think you've done, and then trying to sort of take on those critical insights and then input them back into the book that you've sort of written. I will say though that the difference between writing a first one and a second one, I do have a much better idea at the outset of a certain. I wouldn't say the overall structure. I wouldn't say certainly. I don't know how long it's going to be. I don't know. I mean, there's a number of things I still don't know. But it's not like the writing doesn't get any faster, but I do feel like I write smarter. Like I just have a sense of what got cut in this book, and I have a sense of what I don't, of what seems promising but ends up being a dead end down the road, or what's going to cause you an enormous headache in the conception if you don't take care of it sort of early. So I feel like you can actually snuff out certain infections in your novel earlier on. So that's been slightly more satisfying. But I'm gonna try to go the Edward P. Jones model at some point. So the other thing I heard him say something about how he didn't he didn't sit down to write. Like, instead of writing the known world, he just watched a bunch of TV, and then he would sort of write it in his head, and then eventually he sort of sat down and wrote it all at once. I mean, that sounds nice. But
All right. Well, it's been very nice to have you back here in Iowa City at Prairie Lights
it's
on
been so
this
good to be
side
here.
of the
yeah,
podium.
well, it's been so great. Do I have to leave now? Can I just stand and this feels? I don't want to be.
You're welcome to stay for the rest of the evening. And Casey Walker will be happy to talk with you and sign books for you. They are 25% off. We probably owe you some money then, in some way. So please say hello to him on your way out.
Right.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.